The November fog pressed against the windows of 221B Baker Street like a living thing, its tendrils seeming to muffle even the familiar sounds of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps upon the stairs. Watson sat by the fire, reviewing case notes from his medical practice, while Holmes occupied his customary chair, long fingers steepled beneath his aquiline nose as he contemplated some private theorem. The comfortable silence was shattered by an urgent hammering upon their door, followed by the rapid ascent of heavy boots taking the steps two at a time. Inspector Lestrade burst into their sitting room without ceremony, his usually composed features etched with bewilderment and his regulation coat dripping with condensed fog. "Holmes, Watson," he gasped, removing his bowler with trembling hands. "I find myself confronted with a case that defies every principle of criminal investigation I have learned in 20 years with the Yard." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with interest, though he remained motionless in his chair. "Pray be seated, Lestrade. Your breathing suggests you have run the entire distance from Scotland Yard, and the particular pattern of moisture upon your coat indicates you have spent considerable time standing in the open air examining a crime scene, perhaps?" "Remarkable as always," Lestrade muttered, settling heavily into the offered chair. "Indeed, I have just come from Bishop's Gate, where we have discovered the body of Mr. Cornelius Ashford, the renowned antiquarian book dealer, found dead in his private study not 3 hours ago, seated at his desk as though he had simply laid down his pen and expired." Watson leaned forward, his medical instincts engaged. "Natural causes, then?" "That is precisely what baffles us," Lestrade continued, his voice dropping to an almost reverent whisper. "The circumstances surrounding his death are unlike anything I have encountered. The entire house, Watson, every room, every corridor had been rendered absolutely silent. The doorbell had been muffled with cotton wadding. The grandfather clock in the hall stopped precisely at midnight. Even the servants' quarters showed evidence of deliberate sound dampening. Carpets had been laid over the hardwood floors, curtains drawn and secured, and we found cotton stuffing in the keyholes of every door. Holmes rose with that fluid grace Watson had observed 1,000 times, his tall frame casting dancing shadows in the firelight. "You speak of silence as though it were a weapon, Inspector. Continue." "The victim's niece, Miss Catherine Ashford, discovered the body when she came to breakfast. She swears the house was perfectly normal when she retired at 10 o'clock, yet by morning it had been transformed into this tomb-like silence. Mr. Ashford sat upright at his escritoire, his final letter half completed, but here is the strangest detail." Lestrade produced a small envelope from his coat. "We found this thread caught in the door jamb of his study." Holmes accepted the evidence with delicate fingers, holding it to the gaslight for examination. "Horsehair," he murmured, "twisted and waxed. From a violin bow, specifically one that has seen considerable use. The wear patterns suggest a professional musician's instrument. But what possible connection could exist between a violin and Mr. Ashford's death?" Watson inquired. "Elementary, my dear Watson. Consider the deliberate creation of silence throughout the house, combined with this single strand of evidence from a musical instrument. Our perpetrator has taken extraordinary measures to ensure that no sound would betray their presence or actions." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar light of intellectual pursuit. "Tell me, Lestrade, was anything missing from the study?" "Nothing obvious. His valuable manuscripts remained untouched. His safe stood open but apparently undisturbed. However, we did discover a small pile of ash in the fireplace, recently burned correspondence, by the look of it." Holmes moved to the window, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street. "We are dealing with someone who understands that sound travels in predictable patterns, someone who has taken meticulous care to control the acoustic environment. This suggests either intimate knowledge of the house's construction or professional expertise in matters of sound." "Will you take the case?" Lestrade asked hopefully. Holmes turned from the window, his face animated with purpose. "Indeed, Inspector, the game, as they say, is afoot." Within the hour, their hansom clattered through the fog-shrouded streets toward Bishopsgate, the rhythmic clip of hooves on wet cobblestones providing a stark contrast to the unnatural silence they would soon encounter. Holmes sat forward, his grey eyes fixed upon some invisible theorem, while Watson observed the way the gaslight struggled to penetrate the November mist that clung to every surface like a living shroud. As they passed a street vendor hawking hot chestnuts, Holmes remarked without looking up, "Former military man, Watson. Afghan campaign." Judging by the precise angle of his stance and the slight tremor in his left hand, residual nerve damage from a Jezzail bullet, I'd venture. The Ashford residence loomed before them like a Georgian monument to Victorian propriety, its red brick facade darkened by years of London soot. Even before they alighted from the cab, Watson sensed something profoundly wrong about the atmosphere surrounding the house. The usual sounds of urban life seemed to fade as they approached the wrought iron gate, as though the very air had been muffled by some invisible hand. "The house sits well back from the street," Holmes observed, his keen gaze surveying the property, surrounded by mature elms that would naturally dampen external sounds. Our perpetrator chose their location with considerable forethought. He gestured toward the heavily draped windows. "Note how the curtains remain drawn despite the advanced hour psychological preparation as much as practical necessity." Lestrade admitted them through the front entrance into a vestibule that struck Watson as unnaturally hushed. The familiar creaking of old floorboards, the subtle settling sounds of a Victorian house, even the distant ticking of timepieces, all were conspicuously absent. Their footsteps, despite thick carpeting hastily laid over the original hardwood, seemed to echo with cathedral-like resonance. They were received in the morning room by Miss Catherine Ashford, a young woman of perhaps 25 years, whose auburn hair was pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized both her pallor and the redness around her green eyes. She rose from a velvet armchair, her black morning dress rustling softly against the oppressive quiet, and Watson noted the tremor in her hands despite her composed demeanor. "Inspector Lestrade speaks most highly of your abilities, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice steady though her clasped hands betrayed her distress. "I confess myself completely bewildered by what has transpired in this house." Holmes bowed slightly, already cataloguing details that escaped ordinary observation. "Miss Ashford, before we examine your uncle's study, pray tell us of yesterday evening's events. Omit no detail, however insignificant it may appear." Catherine resumed her seat, gesturing for them to make themselves comfortable. Uncle Cornelius seemed perfectly normal at dinner. We discussed his latest acquisition, a rare manuscript he called The Quietus, containing previously unknown medieval musical compositions. He was quite excited, mentioning it would make his scholarly reputation. Her voice caught slightly. After our meal, he retired to his study as was his custom. I heard the familiar sounds of his work papers shuffling, drawers opening, his chair scraping against the floor. The grandfather clock chimed 10:30, and I retired shortly after. "You heard these sounds distinctly?" Watson inquired gently. "Oh, yes. The study sits directly above my bedroom." Uncle Cornelius was often restless in his work, frequently rising to consult reference volumes. The sounds were quite comforting, actually. Fresh tears gathered in her eyes. When I descended for breakfast, the silence struck me immediately. Something was profoundly wrong. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers forming their familiar steeple. "Has your uncle received any recent visitors of a musical nature?" Catherine hesitated, then nodded. "Mr. Emil Vardek of the Lyric Society called yesterday afternoon. He's a violinist and brought a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. They spoke privately for some time before he departed around 9 o'clock. Holmes's eyes brightened with that familiar light of intellectual pursuit. "Most illuminating. Now, if you would be so kind as to show us to your uncle's study, I believe the scene itself may prove equally instructive." As they rose to follow her down the carpeted corridor, Watson caught the faint scent of ash. And something else. Something resinous, that seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be unveiled. The study door swung open to reveal a chamber that seemed suspended between life and death, where time itself had been commanded to halt. The oppressive silence struck them like a physical force as they crossed the threshold, their footsteps muffled by hastily laid carpeting that covered the original hardwood floors. Holmes paused just inside the doorway, his grey eyes conducting a methodical survey of the room before moving with that characteristic feline grace toward the figure seated at the mahogany escritoire. Cornelius Ashford remained upright in his leather chair, his grey head tilted slightly, as though he had merely dozed while composing correspondence. The unfinished letter lay beneath his relaxed fingers, the ink having dried to a dull brown where his pen had fallen from his grasp. Watson approached with professional detachment, noting the peaceful expression, the absence of any signs suggesting struggle or distress, and the unnatural pallor that spoke of a death both sudden and inexplicably quiet. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, kneeling beside the fireplace where Lestrade had mentioned the burned correspondence. With delicate precision, he extracted several charred fragments using his thin-bladed knife, holding them to the gaslight. "Music paper," he announced, burned hastily but not thoroughly. Note these 5 parallel lines still visible on this fragment. He carefully preserved the evidence in his pocketbook before lifting a small globule of mauve-tinted wax from the fender, foreign sealing wax not commonly found in English stationers. Holmes reached within the mechanism and withdrew a pea-sized portion of dark wax that had been deliberately affixed to the pendulum. "Complete temporal control," he observed with satisfaction. "Our perpetrator required absolute silence at a precise moment." Returning to the study, he ran his fingers along the windowsill, discovering thin strips of felt pinned beneath the heavy draperies with brass tacks whose heads still gleamed with recent handling. Watson's attention was drawn to an ornate music box of Swiss craftsmanship that sat upon a side table, its mother-of-pearl inlays catching the lamplight. Holmes observed the positioning of the deceased's left hand. The fingers are curved as though he had been holding something. Holmes lifted the music box's delicate lid, and immediately a haunting melody began to play, its crystalline notes piercing the oppressive atmosphere like silver needles through velvet. The tune was unfamiliar yet strangely compelling, a minor key composition that seemed to speak of ancient sorrows and forgotten mysteries. Catherine Ashford gasped from the doorway. "That melody, I heard it yesterday evening, just before the house fell silent. Uncle Cornelius must have wound the mechanism after Mr. Vardek departed." Holmes closed the lid abruptly, silencing the ethereal music. "Miss Ashford, this belonged to your late aunt?" "Yes. She passed 3 years ago." Uncle Cornelius rarely opened it, claiming the melody brought painful memories. Holmes turned his attention to the half-completed letter, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. "Most illuminating. Watson, listen, my dear Pemberton, I write to inform you that the Quietus manuscript is not what it appears to be. The musical notations, when properly interpreted, reveal something far more sinister than mere medieval compositions. I fear I have stumbled upon a secret that men have died to protect, and I suspect that I am being—" The letter ends there. Yet note how the ink trails off gradually, not as though the pen were dropped suddenly. Moving to the bookshelves, Holmes ran his hand along the spines of volumes dedicated to medieval musicology. One book protruded slightly from its neighbors, and when he withdrew it, a small, empty space was revealed behind, clearly designed to conceal something of manuscript dimensions. Holmes mused, examining the dust patterns within the hiding place, recently removed, judging by these impressions. He knelt again, this time studying a shallow, crescent-shaped depression in the carpet's nap. A 3-legged stand rested here briefly, perhaps a music stand. Near the door jamb, he discovered another strand of horsehair, twisted and waxed, with amber rosin still adhering to its surface. "Our violinist again, Watson. Mr. Vardek's presence grows increasingly significant." Holmes straightened, his eyes bright with intellectual pursuit. We have a conductor who orchestrated this silence with mathematical precision, Watson. The question now becomes, what power does the Quietus manuscript possess that men would kill to control it? Their contemplation was interrupted by Watson's sharp intake of breath as he knelt beside the deceased antiquarian, his medical training compelling him to conduct a more thorough examination. "Holmes," he called softly, "observe the inner aspect of the left arm, a minute puncture wound with slight bruising around the entry point." He leaned closer, detecting a faint but unmistakable scent. "There's an almond-like odor, though not the bitter intensity one associates with prussic acid." Holmes abandoned his study of the music box to examine Watson's discovery, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. The placid expression suggests a swift, painless death, consistent with certain alkaloid compounds. Yet the absence of convulsions or the violent symptoms typical of cyanide poisoning indicates something more sophisticated. He straightened, his gray eyes bright with intellectual curiosity. Our perpetrator possesses knowledge of both music and chemistry. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of a distinguished gentleman whose silver-headed walking stick tapped against the hastily laid carpeting. Professor Marcus Pemberton of King's College entered with the bearing of academic authority tempered by genuine distress, his steel-gray whiskers and deep-set brown eyes conveying both scholarly gravitas and unmistakable anxiety. "Miss Ashford," he said, removing his top hat with trembling hands, "I received your telegram regarding poor Cornelius. The loss of such a brilliant mind is irreparable." His gaze fell upon Holmes and Watson with curious assessment. "I trust these gentlemen are providing assistance." Holmes stepped forward, already cataloguing the ink stains on the professor's right cuff and the particular wear pattern on his walking stick's silver head. "Professor Pemberton, I presume, your late friend was composing a letter to you when death claimed him. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson." Pemberton's face drained of color. "A letter to me? What could Cornelius have wished to communicate with such urgency?" "He mentioned the Quietus manuscript," Holmes replied, watching the professor's reaction with hawk-like intensity. "He suggested it contained secrets that men have died to protect." The walking stick slipped from Pemberton's nerveless fingers, clattering against the floor. "The Quietus," he whispered, his scholarly composure crumbling. "Dear God, I warned him against pursuing that accursed document." Catherine Ashford moved closer, her green eyes wide with alarm. "Professor, what exactly was this manuscript? Uncle Cornelius spoke of it only as medieval musical compositions." Pemberton retrieved his walking stick with shaking hands. "The Quietus is far more than mere music, Miss Ashford. It represents a 13th-century treatise on what medieval scholars called musica mortis, the music of death. The manuscript contains instructions for using specific musical frequencies to induce various states of consciousness, including what the ancients termed the final silence." Holmes leaned forward. "You speak of music as though it were a weapon, Professor." "In the wrong hands, Mr. Holmes, it most certainly can be." The document was compiled by a Benedictine monk who believed he had discovered the mathematical relationship between sound and the human soul. His experiments resulted in mysterious deaths before the church ordered the manuscript sealed away. Watson felt a chill unrelated to the November fog. Surely such claims belong to superstition rather than science. I thought so too, until I witnessed a demonstration in Prague 3 years ago. A violinist named Emil Vardek performed a fragment before musicologists. 2 elderly professors died within moments, though no physical cause could be determined. Holmes's eyes blazed with understanding. "The same Vardek who visited Mr. Ashford yesterday." Indeed, though publicly he dismissed the Quietus as blasphemy against true music, I suspect his vehement denunciation was merely protective coloring. Vardek has spent years searching for a complete copy. Holmes began pacing, his mind working with mechanical precision. "Consider, Watson, the meticulous sound dampening, the precise timing, the convenient trail of evidence leading directly to our violinist. It possesses an almost theatrical quality, as though designed to guide our investigation along predetermined paths. Lestrade, who had remained silent during these revelations, finally spoke. "But surely the evidence speaks for itself, Holmes. The horsehair, the musical connection, Vardek's presence, precisely my concern. Inspector, when evidence aligns too perfectly, when every clue points toward a single conclusion with mathematical certainty, the wise investigator begins to suspect orchestration rather than coincidence." Holmes resumed his methodical examination of the study with renewed intensity, his grey eyes scanning every surface as though reading an invisible manuscript written in the language of crime. Moving to the leather armchair where Ashford had died, he traced the worn seam along the armrest with delicate precision, his long fingers detecting irregularities that escaped ordinary observation. With the blade of his penknife, he carefully extracted something so minute that only the focused beam of gaslight revealed its nature. A sliver of glass no larger than a fingernail, bearing a microscopic steel barb at one end and traces of the same mauve wax they had discovered earlier. The fragment disappeared into Holmes's waistcoat pocket with the fluid motion of a practiced conjurer, his expression betraying nothing of this significant discovery. "Inspector," he announced, straightening with characteristic authority, "we must question the household staff systematically. The timeline of yesterday evening's events requires absolute clarity." They assembled in the morning room once more, where the oppressive silence seemed to press against the very walls, like a living presence. Mr. Greeley, the butler, stood with dignified composure despite the unusual circumstances, while Ellen, the housemaid, twisted her apron nervously between trembling fingers. A young footman, named Barrett, shifted uncomfortably, clearly unaccustomed to such scrutiny from Scotland Yard. Holmes began his interrogation with surgical precision. "Mr. Greeley, apart from Mr. Vardek's visit, were there any other callers or deliveries yesterday evening?" "No visitors after dusk, sir," the butler replied with measured dignity. "However, a message was delivered by hand around 4 o'clock, brought to the door by a street boy who departed immediately after I accepted it." "Describe this messenger," Holmes commanded, his attention sharpening. "A ragged lad of perhaps 12 years, sir. Wore a torn cap and bore a distinctive sore on his left cheek, appeared to chew tobacco on that side, if I may venture the observation." Holmes nodded with satisfaction. "And Mr. Ashford's reaction to this message?" "He read it in his study, sir, then rang for me to say he was not to be disturbed until morning. Most unusual, as he typically enjoyed our evening discussions about his scholarly pursuits." Watson observed Holmes's slight frown as he examined the bell pull, its braided cord hanging motionless, yet the bell system had been deliberately disabled. Holmes murmured, more to himself than the assembled company. Turning to Ellen, Holmes inquired about the music box that had played such a haunting role in their investigation. "When did you last wind the mechanism, miss?" "Never, sir," she replied with obvious anxiety. "Mr. Ashford kept the key himself, said it brought back memories of his dear wife. I was strictly forbidden to touch it." Catherine Ashford produced the small brass key from a porcelain dish on the mantelpiece. "I found it here this morning, though Uncle Cornelius always carried it in his waistcoat pocket." Holmes accepted the key with apparent casualness, but Watson caught the almost imperceptible narrowing of his friend's eyes as he examined it under his magnifying glass. The detective's thumb brushed against the key's spindle, detecting minute traces of a reddish-brown powder quite distinct from ordinary dust or tarnish. "Most illuminating," Holmes observed, carefully wrapping the key in his handkerchief before returning it. "Inspector, I require you to locate the messenger boy who delivered yesterday's note. He frequents the area near Wormwood Alley and likely seeks employment around the penny theatres by this hour." Lestrade dispatched a constable with these instructions, his confidence growing as the evidence seemed to align with increasing clarity. "The case builds itself, Holmes. Vardek's connection to the mysterious manuscript, his presence at the scene, The musical elements, surely we have enough to make an arrest. Perhaps, Holmes replied with characteristic ambiguity, though Watson detected the subtle skepticism in his friend's tone. However, Inspector, consider how remarkably convenient each piece of evidence appears. When a criminal investigation proceeds with such mathematical precision, the wise detective begins to suspect orchestration rather than mere chance. Professor Pemberton, who had remained largely silent during the questioning, now spoke with visible agitation. Mr. Holmes, surely you cannot doubt the connection between Vardek and these events. His reputation regarding the Quietus manuscript, his demonstrated knowledge of its deadly properties. I doubt nothing, Professor, but I question everything, Holmes interrupted, so smoothly. Experience has taught me that the most obvious solution is often the most carefully constructed deception. Moving to examine Ashford's correspondence more thoroughly, Holmes discovered a hidden compartment in the escritoire containing several letters that had escaped the fire. The first, bearing a Parisian postmark, discussed the availability of medieval manuscripts, while another, purportedly from a Benedictine monastery, warned against the dangers of the Quietus document. Observe, Watson, Holmes said, holding both letters to the gaslight. While the Parisian correspondence employs genuine continental paper and ink, this monastic letter uses English materials designed to appear foreign. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to create an elaborate fiction. Catherine's voice trembled as she spoke. You're suggesting Uncle Cornelius was deliberately deceived? I'm suggesting, Miss Ashford, that your uncle may have discovered he was the victim of an elaborate fraud, and that this discovery may have cost him his life. Holmes folded the letters carefully. The question now becomes whether we are meant to follow the same carefully laid trail that led to his destruction. As the fog thickened outside the windows of Bishopsgate, Holmes stood in contemplative silence, his mind working through the intricate web of deception that seemed to surround them like the November mist itself. The constable's breathless return shattered the contemplative silence that had settled over the study, his urgent report delivered with the gravity of a man who had witnessed something that defied conventional criminal investigation. Removing his helmet with trembling hands despite the November chill, he addressed Inspector Lestrade with obvious bewilderment. Sir, I located the messenger boy precisely where Mr. Holmes indicated, but his account contradicts everything we've been told. Holmes stepped forward with that predatory intensity Watson had observed countless times, his grey eyes sharpening with intellectual hunger rather than surprise. Speak plainly, Constable. What did the boy reveal? The lad swears he delivered no message to Bishopsgate yesterday, sir. Claims he spent the entire afternoon at the Lyceum Theatre, hoping for employment as a program seller. The stage manager confirmed his presence there from 2 o'clock until well past dark, and several other street children corroborated his whereabouts. Watson felt the familiar chill of recognition that accompanied his friend's most brilliant deductions, while Lestrade's confidence began to crumble as this revelation undermined the carefully constructed timeline they had been following. But Greeley's identification was quite specific, the inspector protested. The distinctive sore on the left cheek, the torn cap, the tobacco-chewing habit. Precisely the point, Inspector, Holmes replied, his voice carrying that note of satisfaction that indicated a significant breakthrough. Our true culprit possessed intimate knowledge of the local street children and deliberately selected one whose distinctive appearance would be easily remembered and described. The messenger was an impostor, chosen specifically to create a false trail of evidence. Professor Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his scholarly composure showing signs of strain. You're suggesting someone went to extraordinary lengths to create this deception? More than extraordinary, Professor. I suggest we are dealing with someone who has orchestrated this entire affair with theatrical precision, employing misdirection worthy of the finest stage magicians. Holmes withdrew the glass fragment from his waistcoat pocket, holding it to the gaslight, where its steel barb gleamed with sinister purpose. This device, which I extracted from the armrest of Mr. Ashford's chair, represents a delivery system of remarkable ingenuity. Catherine Ashford leaned forward, her green eyes wide with growing horror. What exactly is that thing, Mr. Holmes? A miniature syringe of sorts, Miss Ashford. The glass breaks upon contact with sufficient pressure, releasing its contents through this steel barb, which ensures penetration through clothing to the skin beneath. The victim would experience only the slightest sensation, perhaps dismissing it as a minor discomfort from his chair's worn upholstery. Watson's medical training engaged as he examined the fragment more closely. But surely such a minute quantity could not prove fatal? Consider the alkaloid compounds derived from certain tropical plants, Watson. A single drop of concentrated extract from the Antiaris toxicaria, properly prepared, could induce the peaceful death we observed. The victim would experience a gentle drowsiness, perhaps believing himself merely fatigued from scholarly pursuits, before consciousness faded entirely. Holmes moved to the ornate music box, lifting its delicate lid to release that haunting melody once more. As the crystalline notes filled the oppressive atmosphere of the study, Watson found himself oddly affected by the sound, experiencing a peculiar lethargy that seemed to seep through his consciousness. "This mechanism has been recently modified," Holmes announced, pointing to tiny holes drilled into the cylinder's surface. Additional perforations that alter the original tune, creating specific frequency patterns designed to enhance the victim's susceptibility to the alkaloid compound. The detective closed the lid abruptly, breaking the spell that had begun to settle over the room. Combined with the poison, this modified melody would render the victim completely compliant, ensuring he remained seated and calm as the toxin took effect. Lestrade struggled to comprehend the implications, but who possesses such specialized knowledge of both chemistry and mechanical precision? Someone with intimate familiarity with Mr. Ashford's scholarly obsessions. Inspector, someone who understood exactly how to create an irresistible lure and could move freely within these walls without arousing suspicion. Holmes's gaze swept the assembled company with uncomfortable intensity. Our perpetrator has demonstrated remarkable knowledge of medieval manuscripts, modern chemistry, and the household's daily routines. The sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor interrupted their discussion, and Mr. Greeley appeared in the doorway, his dignified composure shaken. "Inspector Lestrade, forgive the intrusion, but there has been another development. A gentleman has just arrived claiming to be the real Emile Vardek, and he insists that someone has been impersonating him throughout London." Holmes's eyes blazed with triumph as this final piece of the puzzle fell into place. "Excellent, Greeley. Show him in, immediately." "Watson, I believe we are about to witness the unraveling of one of the most elaborate criminal deceptions I have ever encountered." As they awaited this unexpected visitor, the fog outside Bishopsgate seemed to press more heavily against the windows, as though the very atmosphere conspired to conceal the truth that Holmes was methodically exposing with each brilliant deduction. The gentleman who entered bore little resemblance to the calculating figure their investigation had conjured from scattered evidence and theatrical misdirection. Emile Vardek appeared as a compact, nervous man in his early 40s, his dark hair disheveled from travel and his clothes bearing the authentic patina of a working musician rather than the polished appearance of a social manipulator. His violin case, clutched protectively against his chest, showed the honest wear of countless performances, its leather corners softened by years of careful handling rather than the pristine condition one might expect from a prop in an elaborate deception. "Gentlemen," he began in accented English that carried the musical cadences of Central Europe, "I have traveled through the night from Brighton upon receiving word that my name has been connected with this terrible tragedy. I must protest most vehemently that I have never visited this house, nor have I had any communication with the late Mr. Ashford." His pale blue eyes darted anxiously between the assembled company, settling finally upon Holmes with a mixture of hope and desperation that spoke of genuine distress rather than criminal cunning. Holmes studied the newcomer with that penetrating gaze Watson had witnessed countless times, noting the calluses on fingertips consistent with years of violin practice, the slight forward lean of shoulders shaped by decades of musical performance, and the unmistakable authenticity of a man whose entire being was devoted to his art. "Mr. Vardek, your appearance is most timely. Pray, tell us your whereabouts yesterday evening." "I was performing with the Brighton Philharmonic Society," Vardek replied, producing both a concert program and hotel receipt from his coat pocket with trembling fingers. "The performance concluded at 10:30, after which I remained at the Grand Hotel. I have witnesses, documentation, anything you require to establish my innocence." Watson observed the man's obvious sincerity, while Holmes examined the evidence with his magnifying glass, verifying the authenticity of the printing and paper quality. The concert program bore the distinctive typography of a Brighton printer, and the hotel receipt showed charges consistent with an overnight stay. "The evidence supports your claim, Mr. Vardek," Holmes announced, "yet someone bearing your name and reputation visited this house yesterday afternoon, demonstrating intimate knowledge of your alleged theories regarding the Quietus manuscript and your professional methods." Vardek's face drained of color as the implications became clear. "Someone has been impersonating me? But why would anyone assume such a risk?" "Because, Mr. Vardek, your reputation regarding medieval death music provided the perfect foundation for an elaborate deception," Holmes replied, withdrawing the horsehair strand from his waistcoat pocket. "Examine this evidence, if you would." The violinist accepted the twisted hair with professional familiarity, rolling it between nimble fingers before placing it beneath his nose. Hungarian amber rosin, but adulterated with benzoin gum. No serious musician would contaminate their bow with such a commercial blend. Holmes's eyes blazed with satisfaction at this confirmation of his suspicions. "And the mauve sealing wax we discovered?" Aniline died, a triumph of modern chemistry over traditional methods. "I know only one dealer who scents his mauve wax with orris root, a vanity that appeals to copyists and forgers who wish their correspondence to suggest aristocratic origins." Professor Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his scholarly composure showing signs of strain as these technical details accumulated like accusations. "You paint a rather sordid picture of London's antiquarian trade, Mr. Vardek." "I speak only from experience, Professor. The market for rare manuscripts attracts both legitimate scholars and sophisticated criminals who exploit collectors' obsessions." Holmes moved to examine the ornate music box once more, his long fingers tracing the mechanism's recent modifications. "Mr. Vardek, would you recognize the work of a skilled instrument restorer?" "Certainly. The drilling of additional holes in this cylinder, the precise placement to alter the original melody, this represents the work of someone with considerable mechanical expertise and intimate knowledge of musical theory." The detective's attention was interrupted by Mr. Greeley's urgent appearance in the doorway, his dignified composure thoroughly shaken. "Inspector Lestrade, forgive the intrusion, but young Barrett cannot be found anywhere in the house. His livery is missing, and the servant's entrance has been left unbolted." Lestrade dispatched constables immediately, while Holmes examined the threshold where Barrett would have passed. "Felt overshoes," he observed, kneeling to study minute impressions in the carpet's nap. "And here flakes of shellac varnish, tinted with dragon's blood resin." He rose, his face animated with intellectual triumph. "Our conspirator has fled, but not before leaving a trail that speaks volumes about his true profession." Holmes turned to address the assembled company with that authority Watson had witnessed in countless investigations. "We are dealing with someone who possesses intimate knowledge of instrument restoration, medieval manuscripts, and the household's daily routines. The impersonation of Mr. Vardek was merely the opening movement in a complex composition designed to conceal the true perpetrator's identity." Catherine Ashford's voice trembled as she spoke. "You're suggesting Uncle Cornelius was murdered by someone he trusted?" "I'm suggesting, Miss Ashford, that your uncle discovered he was the victim of an elaborate fraud involving forged manuscripts and false scholarly credentials. This discovery may have cost him his life." Holmes folded the technical evidence carefully. "The question now becomes whether we can follow the trail before our quarry disappears entirely into London's criminal underworld." As the fog thickened outside Bishopsgate, Holmes stood in contemplative silence, his mind working through the intricate web of deception that surrounded them. The real Emil Vardek had provided crucial evidence, but the true architect of this elaborate crime remained hidden behind layers of misdirection as complex as any musical composition ever written. Holmes's request for the wax dealer's identity struck with the precision of a rapier thrust, his grey eyes fixed upon Vardek with that familiar intensity Watson had witnessed countless times. The violinist's brow furrowed as memory assembled its careful catalogue of London's specialised tradesmen. "Isaiah Blount maintains a shop in Street John's Lane, Clerkenwell," he replied with professional certainty. "He supplies copyists and restorers with sealing waxes, rosin blends, and various antiquarian materials. His orris-scented mauve wax is quite distinctive among those who work near Street John's Gate." Holmes's hat was already in his hand before the sentence had fully formed. His tall frame, animated with that predatory energy, Watson recognized as the prelude to significant discovery. "Come, Watson. Inspector, bring 2 reliable men. Mr. Vardek, your professional expertise may prove decisive in what we are about to uncover." Their hansom carved a path through the fog-shrouded streets like a lantern launched upon an opaque sea, the rhythmic clip of hooves on wet cobblestones providing counterpoint to the oppressive silence that seemed to follow their investigation. Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers drumming against the leather rail in a restless tattoo that betrayed the intensity of his thoughts. Watson knew better than to disturb such contemplation, recognizing that in these moments the smallest stimulus might reshape the entire architecture of his friend's reasoning. Clerkenwell's narrow streets received them with the hush of a neighborhood long past its respectable hour. Street John's Gate loomed like a medieval sentinel against the November mist, while Street John's Lane showed but a single lamp burning above what appeared to be a shuttered antiquarian shop. A faint perfume, powdery and unmistakable, laced the cold air that escaped from a cracked transom window. "Orris," Holmes murmured with satisfaction. "Mr. Blount maintains late hours, it would seem." The detective's lockpicks made swift work of the front entrance, admitting them to a shop whose counters displayed an almost monastic precision of organization. Bars of mauve wax bound with twine, spools of horsehair, vials labeled benzoin and gum mastic, and a distinctive tin bearing the legend "Dragon's Blood Resin" created an inventory that spoke eloquently of specialized knowledge and criminal preparation. Watson noted immediately that the shop's bell had been swaddled with cotton, while strips of felt lay across the floorboards where footsteps would naturally fall. The same studied hush they had encountered at Bishopsgate pervaded this space, transforming a legitimate business into a stage dressed for the drama of absolute silence. A muffled groan from behind a beaded curtain led them to a cramped workroom where they discovered Isaiah Blount himself, trussed like a parcel with his ear canals plugged with wool and his mouth secured with silk. Lestrade freed the portly shopkeeper while Holmes's hands traveled the surfaces with feline precision, cataloguing evidence with that methodical thoroughness Watson had observed in countless investigations. A gentleman arrived not an hour past. Blount gasped, gulping air with desperate gratitude. Though he bore himself more like a tradesman masquerading as his betters, he demanded I pack a parcel of wax, rosin, and shellac, bringing a young footman to carry the materials. When I hesitated, he pressed a silver-headed walking stick against my ribs with the confidence of one accustomed to violence. Holmes discovered the workbench that had served as the criminal's laboratory, a small hand press, a set of punches finer than a watchmaker's tools, and fixed in a vise. a brass cradle perfectly sized to hold a music box cylinder, while fresh perforations were drilled with mechanical precision. In the ash pan of a small stove, charred fragments of music paper revealed the shadow of medieval notation rendered in a hand that attempted historical authenticity, but betrayed modern haste in its crowded ascenders. The real revelation lay in a corner where felt overshoes dusted with shellac flakes, the color of watered wine, sat abandoned beside a strip of livery braid and a single brass button bearing a rampant griffin. Catherine Ashford's family crest, confirming Barrett's infiltration of the household. Holmes examined a ledger whose pages revealed an entry in handwriting that mimicked Blount's style, but missed the characteristic pressure on downstrokes. 2 parcels prepared, he announced, his voice carrying that note of triumph. Watson knew preceded a significant breakthrough. One addressed to a scholar at King's College, the second deliberately left without destination. Vardek, examining the adulterated rosin, confirmed Holmes's suspicions about the material's deliberate contamination. No serious musician would tolerate such commercial blending, he stated with professional authority. As they prepared to depart, Holmes paused at the threshold, his keen hearing detecting the faint roll of cartwheels in the fog-shrouded lane beyond. Our quarry changes venues as we speak, Watson. The performance approaches its final movement, and we must ensure we arrive before the curtain falls. The November mist seemed to press more heavily against the windows of London as they emerged into the night, carrying with them evidence that would soon unmask one of the most elaborate criminal deceptions Holmes had ever encountered. The sound of cartwheels rolling through the fog-shrouded streets drew Holmes's attention with predatory intensity, his grey eyes tracking the rhythmic clatter that seemed to weave through Clerkenwell's ancient lanes like a thread leading toward some inevitable conclusion. Without hesitation, he gestured for silence and led their small party through the maze of narrow passages, his long strides carrying them past shuttered workshops and darkened tenements as they followed the retreating echo through London's labyrinthine heart. Watson found himself struggling to match his friend's pace as they navigated cobblestones slick with condensed mist, their footsteps muffled by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to muffle even their breathing. Lestrade's constables followed with professional determination, while Vardek clutched his violin case protectively, his musician's instincts alert to every sound that penetrated the November night, surrounding them like a living shroud. They discovered the abandoned cart in a narrow mews off the Strand, its black mare standing patiently in the traces while steam rose from her flanks in the cold air. Holmes was beside the animal before their hansom had fully stopped, his delicate fingers finding traces of the same tinted shellac upon the bridle leather that had marked their investigation from its beginning. The cart itself bore evidence of hasty unloading impressions in the wooden bed where heavy crates had rested, and scattered straw that still held the distinctive perfume of orris root. A door at the rear of the mews stood slightly ajar, its bell wrapped in the same cotton wadding they had encountered at Bishopsgate. From within issued a breath of air that carried the mingled scents of hot iron, resin, and that powdery sweetness that had become the signature of their elusive quarry. Holmes beckoned them forward into a narrow passage where felt strips had been laid to deaden their footfalls, and recent scuff marks on the skirting board betrayed the hurried passage of someone carrying an awkward burden. The chamber beyond had been transformed into a workshop of criminal precision, its windows stuffed with cotton, the hearth blocked, and the floor buried beneath layered carpets that created an environment of absolute acoustic control. Upon a sturdy trestle table lay an empty crate stenciled with the seal of King's College, while beside it stood the apparatus they had been tracking, a brass cradle designed to hold music box cylinders, an array of micro-punches still flecked with metal filings, and vials whose contents spoke eloquently of the alkaloid compounds that had claimed Cornelius Ashford's life. Holmes examined the evidence with that methodical thoroughness Watson had observed countless times, his magnifying glass revealing details that painted a complete picture of the criminal operation. "Observe the precision, Watson," he murmured, indicating the perfectly drilled holes in a discarded cylinder. Our perpetrator possesses not merely knowledge of chemistry and acoustics, but the mechanical skills of a master craftsman. The discovery of Barrett's abandoned livery in a corner of the room, along with a set of workman's clothes that would allow anonymous movement through London's streets, confirmed the footman's continuing role in the conspiracy. Holmes found traces of the same mauve wax beneath the young man's fingernails where he had handled the sealing materials, while his discarded shoes bore impressions of the specialized tools they had discovered at Blount's shop. "The final performance approaches," Holmes announced, examining a hastily scrawled note that bore directions to the river rooms at King's College. "Our architect has moved his operation to a venue that will provide both the acoustic properties he requires and an audience worthy of his intellectual vanity." Lestrade dispatched constables to secure the building's exits, while Holmes studied a map of the college grounds that had been marked with notations indicating sound-dampening materials and strategic positioning. The criminal's thoroughness was evident in every detail, from the timing of the evening's events to the selection of chambers that would amplify or muffle sound according to his precise requirements. Watson observed his friend's expression as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "He seeks not merely financial gain," Holmes said, his voice carrying that note of intellectual satisfaction that preceded his most brilliant deductions. "This elaborate performance has been designed to establish his reputation as the sole interpreter of the Quietus manuscript's secrets. He intends to demonstrate his mastery before an audience of scholars who will validate his claims and ensure his place in academic history." Vardek, examining the abandoned musical apparatus, confirmed Holmes's assessment of the criminal's technical expertise. "The modifications to these cylinders represent months of careful work," he observed with professional appreciation. "Whoever created these possesses intimate knowledge of both medieval, musical theory and modern mechanical precision." As they prepared to leave the mews, Holmes paused at the threshold. His keen hearing detecting the distant chime of a college bell carried on the fog-laden air. "The performance has already begun, Watson. Our quarry has transformed King's College into his concert hall, and we must arrive before his final movement reaches its deadly crescendo." The hansom bore them swiftly along the Strand toward the imposing Gothic facade of the college, where scattered windows glowed with lamplight through the November mist. Holmes's hand touched Watson's sleeve with that familiar pressure that indicated the approach of a crucial moment in their investigation. "Remember, my dear fellow, we are dealing with someone who thinks in musical terms, movements, themes, and reprises. He will have prepared multiple variations for his finale, and we must be ready to counter each one." The fog seemed to thicken as they approached their destination, as though the very atmosphere conspired to conceal the truth that Holmes was methodically exposing with each brilliant deduction. The Gothic spires of King's College emerged from the fog like medieval sentinels, their stone facades darkened by years of London soot, while scattered windows glowed with amber light that seemed to pulse with unnatural rhythm. Holmes led their party through the main gates with predatory confidence, his grey eyes already cataloguing the strategic positions where sound might travel and where their quarry would have prepared his final performance. The porter's lodge stood conspicuously empty, its occupant presumably dismissed by some fabricated emergency, while the corridors beyond showed evidence of recent acoustic preparation that transformed the usually echoing halls into passages of tomb-like quiet. They discovered the river rooms on the second floor, where a door stood slightly ajar to reveal a chamber that had been transformed into a concert hall of criminal precision. Heavy tapestries draped the walls, layered carpets muffled every footfall, and the tall windows had been sealed with wax and cotton until the space achieved that oppressive silence they had encountered throughout their investigation. Upon a central table stood the apparatus they had been tracking, an ornate music box whose cylinder bore fresh perforations drilled with mathematical precision, while nearby rested vials whose contents spoke eloquently of the alkaloid compounds that had claimed Cornelius Ashford's life. Professor Marcus Pemberton stood before a small assembly of distinguished scholars, his silver-headed walking stick laid across the table like a conductor's baton, his scholarly composure maintained despite the intensity of his purpose. Barrett, no longer disguised as a footman but dressed in workman's clothes, hovered near the door with the nervous energy of an accomplice awaiting his moment of triumph. The professor's voice carried that familiar academic authority as he addressed his captive audience. "Gentlemen," Pemberton announced with theatrical gravity, "we gather to witness the exposition of medieval acoustics, long misunderstood by modern scholarship. Allow me to demonstrate the mathematical relationship between harmonic frequencies and the human nervous system." His thumb reached toward the mechanism's activation lever with practiced precision. Holmes moved with fluid grace into the chamber, his voice cutting through the prepared atmosphere with chilling clarity. "A moment, Professor. You have forgotten to account for environmental variables." Before Pemberton could respond, Holmes gestured sharply to Lestrade's constables, who immediately threw open the sealed windows, allowing the damp breath of the Thames to rush in like a tide while simultaneously striking metal against stone to shatter the carefully constructed acoustic environment. "Now, Mr. Vardek," Holmes commanded with surgical precision, "your E-string, if you please, a quarter turn sharp and give me wolf tones in sustained bow strokes." The violinist's hands moved with professional obedience, producing harsh, buzzing intervals that filled the space with disagreeable overtones that made teeth ache and concentration impossible. Pemberton's face drained of color as his elaborate preparation crumbled. "Stop him!" he shouted, slamming the activation lever, but the cylinder's delicate melody was immediately overwhelmed by Vardek's crude interference and the river's chaotic breath, its suggestive harmonics scattered like leaves in a gale. "Observe," Holmes remarked with clinical detachment, "the quietus requires absolute acoustic control, and we have made the environment unruly." Barrett lunged for the exit, but Lestrade's men were faster, seizing him as he attempted to flee while his boot heels skidded across the waxed floor. Pemberton snatched up his walking stick, its silver head flashing under the lamplight, but Holmes had already anticipated this movement, his long fingers closing on both the weapon and the professor's wrist with surprising strength. The stick clattered to the floor, revealing the reddish varnish stains Watson had observed during their investigation. Holmes said without raising his voice, "You will find traces of orris-scented mauve wax beneath the professor's fingernails, shellac particles on his right cuff, and a bruise pattern on this stick's ferrule that matches Mr. Blount's description precisely." As Lestrade moved to secure the evidence, Holmes lifted the modified cylinder from its cradle with the delicacy of a surgeon handling extracted shrapnel. Pemberton found his voice at last, though it emerged hoarse and stripped of scholarly authority. "You destroy knowledge," he said, glaring at Holmes with hatred that bordered on desperation. "You prefer ignorance to mastery." Holmes regarded him with cool pity. "On the contrary, Professor, I prefer truth to theatre and ethics to intellectual vanity. Your composition is clever, but you have mistaken a parlor trick for genuine science." The constables led both conspirators away while Holmes closed the windows with his own hands, shutting out the river's disrupting breath. "We return to Bishopsgate," he announced, securing the cylinder in his pocket case. "The final answers await where our first questions were posed." The November fog seemed to lift slightly as they emerged into the night, carrying with them the resolution of one of the most elaborate criminal deceptions Holmes had ever encountered. The return journey to Bishopsgate unfolded through fog that seemed to lift with each revelation, as though London itself exhaled the oppressive atmosphere that had shrouded their investigation from its beginning. Catherine Ashford awaited them in the morning room, where the first pale light of dawn struggled through windows, finally freed from their cotton bondage, casting gentle illumination upon features that bore both grief and the dawning hope of understanding. Holmes settled into the chair opposite her with uncharacteristic gentleness, while Watson took his familiar position nearby. The weight of their discoveries settling around them like the gradual return of natural sound to a house too long silenced. "Miss Ashford," Holmes began, his grey eyes reflecting both intellectual satisfaction and genuine compassion, Your uncle died because his scholarly integrity threatened to expose one of the most elaborate academic frauds I have ever encountered. Professor Pemberton, driven by vanity and the hunger for recognition that consumes lesser minds, conceived a plan that would establish him as the world's foremost authority on medieval death music, regardless of the human cost of his ambition. Holmes withdrew the modified music box cylinder from his pocket case, its brass surface catching the morning light like evidence given form. The conspiracy began months ago when Pemberton realized he could exploit your uncle's passion for rare manuscripts. He created an elaborate fiction, forging correspondence from continental monasteries, and crafting warnings about the Quietus manuscript that were designed to pique scholarly curiosity while establishing the document's dangerous reputation. The professor's knowledge of paleography and medieval notation enabled him to create a forgery sophisticated enough to deceive casual examination, but not thorough enough to withstand your uncle's expert scrutiny. Catherine leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly as the scope of the deception became clear. Uncle Cornelius discovered the fraud? Indeed. His unfinished letter reveals that he had begun to detect anachronisms in the medieval notation and inconsistencies in the supporting documentation. When he wrote that he feared he had stumbled upon a secret that men have died to protect, he was not referring to ancient mysteries, but to Pemberton's modern deception. This realization sealed his fate, for the professor could not allow his elaborate fiction to be exposed by genuine scholarship. Watson's medical training engaged as Holmes continued. The murder itself was executed with diabolical precision. Pemberton recruited Barrett through financial inducement, providing him with access to the household's routines and enabling the extensive sound dampening that transformed this house into a stage for theatrical murder. The silence was not required to conceal the crime itself, which was designed to be imperceptible, but to ensure that when the modified music box played its haunting melody, it would be the only sound heard, reinforcing the myth of deadly music. Holmes indicated the glass fragment with its minute steel barb. The actual weapon was concealed within the armrest of your uncle's favorite chair, a tiny syringe containing alkaloid compounds derived from tropical plants. When your uncle settled into his accustomed position to write, the pressure activated this ingenious device, delivering a dose calculated to induce peaceful unconsciousness followed by swift death. The almond-like scent Dr. Watson detected was a subtle trace of this compound, chosen specifically because the public associates such odors with prussic acid, creating another layer of misdirection. The elaborate trail of evidence, Holmes continued, was meticulously constructed to implicate the genuine Emil Vardek. The horsehair from instrument restorers, the mauve wax scented with orris root, the false messenger boy with distinctive features, all were theatrical elements designed to consume Scotland Yard's attention, while Pemberton prepared to emerge as the heroic interpreter of the Quietus manuscript's dead secrets. Catherine's voice trembled as understanding dawned. He killed Uncle Cornelius to establish his own reputation? Precisely, Miss Ashford. Professor Pemberton transformed legitimate academic inquiry into an instrument of murder, exploiting your uncle's scholarly passion to create both victim and validation for his fraudulent expertise. Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace, where he had first discovered the burned correspondence. Your uncle's death was intended to serve as proof of the Quietus manuscript's power, while simultaneously eliminating the one person capable of exposing its fraudulent nature. As the November sun finally broke through London's perpetual haze, Holmes stood at the window with that familiar expression of intellectual satisfaction tempered by genuine regret for the human cost of criminal ambition. The case demonstrates that the most dangerous criminals are often those who possess both intelligence and education, for they can construct deceptions of remarkable sophistication. As your uncle proved through his final act of scholarly courage, truth has a way of asserting itself against even the most elaborate lies. The oppressive silence that had characterized Bishopsgate throughout their investigation finally lifted completely, replaced by the natural sounds of a London morning and the quiet dignity of justice served. The formalities concluded by noon, with Pemberton and Barrett formally charged at Scotland Yard, while the November fog finally lifted to reveal London cleansed of the oppressive atmosphere that had shrouded their investigation. Holmes stood once more in Cornelius Ashford's study, where morning sunlight now streamed freely through windows no longer muffled by deception, his grey eyes surveying the scene where truth had ultimately triumphed over elaborate fraud. Catherine Ashford moved to her uncle's chair, her fingers resting gently upon the leather armrest where the concealed weapon had delivered its fatal dose. "Uncle Cornelius often spoke of the responsibility that comes with knowledge," she said softly, her voice carrying both grief and growing understanding. "He believed scholars serve as guardians of truth, and that this guardianship sometimes requires personal courage." Holmes nodded with uncharacteristic solemnity. "Your uncle demonstrated precisely such courage when he chose to expose Pemberton's fraud, despite understanding the personal danger this revelation might entail. His unfinished letter represents an act of scholarly heroism that deserves recognition alongside any military decoration." Inspector Lestrade entered with confirmation that both conspirators had confessed under the weight of evidence Holmes had methodically assembled. "The professor maintains his research was legitimate," Lestrade reported, "but the jury will distinguish clearly between academic inquiry and premeditated murder." Emile Vardek, his reputation restored, carefully examined the ornate music box whose haunting melody had served as both weapon and misdirection. Pemberton transformed a beautiful instrument into something sinister, he observed with professional horror mixed with appreciation for the technical skill involved. He corrupted music itself in service of criminal ambition. Holmes accepted the music box, its weight seeming to carry the accumulated deceptions of their entire investigation. "The case illustrates a fundamental principle, Watson. When evidence aligns with mathematical precision, when every clue points toward a single conclusion without contradiction, the wise detective suspects orchestration rather than coincidence. Pemberton's greatest error lay in creating a deception too perfect to be believable." Watson closed his medical bag, having completed final documentation of the murder method's sophistication. "The alkaloid compound suggests extensive preparation and knowledge of tropical botany." Indeed, yet all his preparation could not account for the one variable he failed to consider: that genuine scholarship, represented by Ashford's meticulous examination, would ultimately expose his deception. Truth possesses a resilience that even the most elaborate lies cannot overcome indefinitely. As they prepared to depart, Catherine accompanied them to the entrance where their hansom waited in pale sunlight. "Mr. Holmes," she said, extending her hand with genuine gratitude, "you have given me something more valuable than justice. You have preserved Uncle Cornelius's reputation and ensured his final act of scholarly courage will be remembered." Holmes accepted her handshake with uncharacteristic warmth. "Miss Ashford, your uncle's legacy lies not merely in exposing fraud, but in demonstrating that pursuing truth sometimes requires personal sacrifice. That lesson will outlive both the criminal who exploited him and the detective who brought that criminal to justice." The hansom bore them through London's awakening streets, where fog had finally lifted to reveal a city cleansed of oppressive atmosphere. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, while Watson reflected upon a case demonstrating both the heights of human integrity and depths of intellectual corruption. Another case concluded. "Watson," Holmes remarked, as Baker Street appeared through morning haze, "though I confess this investigation has left me with deeper appreciation for the courage required to defend truth against sophisticated deception. Pemberton possessed considerable gifts, yet chose to employ them in service of vanity rather than knowledge." Back at 221B, Holmes settled into his armchair, violin across his knee, drawing soft, melancholic notes that filled their rooms with peace rather than the orchestrated quiet of Bishopsgate. "The greatest mysteries, Watson, are often not those appearing most complex, but those deliberately simplified by their orchestrator. The very perfection of Pemberton's lie betrayed it." He rose, reaching for his pipe. I believe Mrs. Hudson mentioned an intriguing disappearance in Belgravia, a prize canary, though one never knows what larger patterns may be glimpsed in the smallest of feathers. Smoke curled from his pipe as he turned toward fresh challenges, leaving Watson to reflect once more on his friend's boundless ingenuity and the endless tapestry of human affairs that ever called for his unique genius.